Hello, and welcome to the presentation on Harris's Why Not Clone. Harris directly takes on Putnam's arguments in this piece, so it works well as a counterpoint to the first presentation for this section. So as you go through this piece, try to remember Putnam's original piece and ask yourself how well Harris's arguments work to counter Putnam's. Another thing to remember is that Putnam's arguments depend on Kantian reasoning, so accepting it likely means accepting many other implications of that moral theory. With that said, let's move on. While Hilary Putnam describes the reaction to Dolly, the first cloned mammal, as a welling up of moral concern, John Harris disagrees. He describes the reaction to the birth of Dolly as a hysterical reaction. Of course, the word hysterical here does not mean funny, as it sometimes does colloquially. Instead, it means panicked in an unjustified way. Perhaps one sign of how influential the impact of Dolly was can be shown by the fact that when looking up clone in Microsoft PowerPoint clip art, I found this image as one of only 3 results. Harris says that in this particular piece he is interested in 3 questions. First, does the creation of Dolly constitute an attack on human rights and dignity? Second, does the legislative response to Dolly constitute an attack on human rights and dignity? Third, are human dollies protected by existing conventions and assumptions regarding human rights? It should be noted here that Harris is talking about more than just one cloned sheep named Dolly when he uses the word Dolly. For example, when he asks if Dolly constitutes an attack on human rights and dignity, the real question he is concerned with is whether or not what Dolly represents, the potential for human cloning, would be an attack on human rights and dignity. Harris notes that upon the arrival of Dolly, many legislative and regulative bodies, as well as professional societies, took action against human cloning. The president, Clinton at the time, for example, called for a moratorium on all public spending on human cloning research. The European Parliament tried to make research on human cloning a criminal offense. The World Health Organization, WHO, said, "WHO considers the use of human cloning for the replication of human individuals to be ethically unacceptable, as it would violate some of the basic principles which govern medically assisted procreation. These include respect for the dignity of the human being and protection of the security of human genetic material." Once again, here's the quote mentioned on the previous slide. Harris points out that objections like these are extremely vague, and also that no effort is made or argument is given to defend the claims. For example, how is human dignity threatened by human cloning? What basic principles of procreation are violated, and what are their justifications? And how is the security of genetic material threatened by human cloning? Without any such arguments, Harris believes, we should remain free to make choices about how we procreate. This would mean being free to procreate by cloning ourselves if we choose. Further, Harris gives some reasons to doubt objections such as those made by WHO. He points out that maternal twins also share the same DNA just as clones would. If 2 beings sharing the same DNA threatens human dignity, then does that mean that twins have less dignity than other human beings? As for security of genetic material, he points out that the average male spreads around genetic material fairly indiscriminately, and nobody sees this as a threat to humanity. Indeed, he points out that lots of genetic material is lost to the sin of Onan. This is a way of referring to masturbation, although it may be worth noting that some biblical scholars claim that the sin was something else. It has often and traditionally been interpreted as masturbation, however. Anyway, Harris's point is that nobody feels the need to take presidential or parliamentary measures to prevent it for the sake of the security of human genetic material. It is also worth noting that we lose massive amounts of genetic material when shedding skin cells, losing blood or hair or saliva, or many other bodily bits or fluids. A little bit more could be said about Harris's comparison of twins and clones. The comparison is regarding maternal twins, genetically identical twins, as opposed to fraternal twins. Maternal twins are created when a zygote, fertilized by one sperm, divides into 2 and then grows into 2 fetuses. Fraternal twins occur when multiple sperm fertilize multiple eggs. Fraternal twins share no more DNA in common than normal brothers and sisters. Scientists are able to deliberately divide the zygotes of animals to cause them to twin, which might be called a form of cloning, but it isn't cloning from an adult cell. But how do twins compare to clones? Though Harris doesn't mention in his piece, it turns out that maternal twins are actually more identical than clones are, or at least clones created by a method like that used to create Dolly. This may surprise many of you, but it is absolutely true. Twins are more identical than clones for a number of reasons. First is because maternal twins share the same mitochondrial DNA, while clones would not. Mitochondrial DNA is not contained in the nucleus, clone source, that is transferred into the egg that has its nucleus removed, but rather in the mitochondria in the cells. It therefore isn't transferred when creating clones by current methods like those used to create Dolly. Maternal twins are more alike because they also share the same environment when developing, while clones develop in different wombs, or perhaps the same womb at different times. Hormones and nutrition and chemical exposure early on can have profound influence on how a child develops. Harris notes that Kantian ethics is often invoked for arguments involving human dignity. We should therefore remind ourselves of the Kantian maxim to always treat humanity, including yourself, as ultimate ends and never as a means to an end only. If you recall, when we originally covered the kingdom of ends version of the categorical imperative, we paraphrased it saying that it was an instruction saying, don't use people as mere tools. There's a word for using people like tools. This word is instrumentalization. So the Kantian objection to cloning is that it somehow instrumentalizes or turns people into tools or instruments, mere things. But if creating a zygote by cloning is instrumentalizing persons, wouldn't it also be instrumentalizing persons to use in vitro fertilization, which usually creates more embryos than are used? Yet the vast majority of people who are against cloning are not against in vitro fertilization. Harris also points out that it is questionable whether or not zygotes or embryos actually fall under the definition of persons. Much effort in the abortion debate is spent arguing over just this issue. Giving moral status to zygotes is especially difficult for a Kantian who requires the ability to act rationally to be of direct moral value. A zygote or even a fetus does not have this ability. But Harris points out that if cloning is wrong for these reasons, then to be consistent, opponents of cloning would need to say that there is something wrong with in vitro fertilization and abortion as well. Though Harris doesn't mention it, they may also have to say there's something wrong with stem cell research and perhaps even birth control, depending on the Kantian reason for giving value to an embryo. The other reason Harris thinks that a Kantian might say that human cloning is wrong is not because it does something to the zygotes or embryos, but because of how it affects the future rational agent that will result. In response to this, Harris points out that it is still in the best interest of that agent to exist rather than not to exist. Also, there are additional objections that will be given against Putnam's concern, which will follow shortly. If we recall, the horror of the cloning scenario for Putnam was the idea that parents would have cloned children to be just like so-and-so, and that these children would be seen as objects that are part of a lifestyle like cars or boats or television sets. You will recall also that Putnam responded to Lewontin, who pointed out that most employer-employee relationships use people as a means to an end. To this, Putnam said that Lewontin didn't fully understand Kant's maxim, which restricts one from using people as a means to an end only, and that further we have standards of civilization that govern how we treat employees. If you recall also, in the last PowerPoint I asked you to remember Putnam's response and ask yourself if you felt it was fair so you could reflect upon it in this presentation. In our current piece, Harris comes to Lewontin's defense. The problem isn't that Lewontin misunderstands Kant's principle, Harris says, but rather that most real-world cases are mixed cases. By mixed cases we mean cases where people are partially being used as a means to an end and are also valued for their own humanity as autonomous agents. It is this area that Harris thinks that Kant is not of much help. Harris agrees with Putnam that Kant's maxim can show why slavery or Nazism is wrong. Those are extreme cases where people are treated completely as objects. But in the vast majority of cases, Putnam thinks that we have mixed intentions. So here comes Putnam's main argument. He asks, if having a clone child is wrong because you want a child that has a better chance of being an athlete, like so-and-so, or live to be 100 like so-and-so, or be intelligent like so-and-so, how is that morally any different from having a child to carry on the family name, having a child to have an heir, having a child so that somebody will help take care of you in your old age, having a child so that your other child will have a brother or sister, having a child because you always wanted to be a mother or father, having a child because your tribe or culture's population is dangerously low, having a child because you believe your religion tells you to be fruitful, having a child to pass on your genes, having a child to pass on your values, having a child to pass on your knowledge, and so on and so on. Having a child purely for any of these reasons, Harris would agree, would be bad. But when parents have a child to have an heir or carry on the family name, or because they believe their religion tells them to, they almost always still end up loving the child. Harris asks what reason we have to think this won't be true for clone children also. Likewise, just as with employees, we have civilized rules regarding how we are supposed to treat our children. Indeed, these rules are probably stronger than with employees. Harris again points out that there's no reason to think that these same standards would not apply to clone children. Again, the use of maternal twins is instructive here. Nobody thinks that it's okay to abuse one maternal twin because there is another genetically identical one, so why would anybody think that it's okay to abuse a person who is essentially just a twin born at a later date? Putnam also points out that if any parent has a clone thinking that the child will be psychologically just like the DNA donor, they are in for a big surprise. Clones are not mindless copies of another person. They are individuals, again, every bit as much as twins are. And thus, they will develop their own personalities and be able to act as rational agents and make their own moral decisions just as twins do. It also might be instructive to think back to the first in vitro baby in the US, the so-called test tube baby Louise Brown. Her birth in 1978 was highly controversial. People called it playing God, and some televangelists and religious leaders even said she didn't have a soul. Many of the same objections were raised against in vitro fertilization as with human cloning, such as why not just adopt, or it is playing God, or it will be used irresponsibly, and so forth. Now IVF is a commonplace procedure that few people think twice about. It has become so accepted that it is used even by many people who identify as very conservative fundamentalist Christians in the US, the exact demographic that objected so much to it originally. Harris also talks about Putnam's moral image. Putnam, you will recall, acknowledged that there are many moral images that can lead to equally good or moral lives. Harris adds that there are also many interpretations of the same moral image that can lead to equally good lives. If you recall, Putnam said that any good moral image of the family must allow its members to be autonomous agents. This was the source of one of his primary objections against cloning. From this, Putnam said that a moral image of the family is one that has a willingness to accept diversity. This was the source of his concern against cloning. But Harris points out that he accepts the same moral image and also values diversity. But Harris values diversity enough that he thinks that families should be able to be diverse enough to include clones if they want to. Harris believes that a tolerance of diversity means that people be permitted to follow their own moral image, which would include cloning if that fits their moral image of a family. What's more, Harris points out that even if cloning did run counter to a moral image, it doesn't follow from that alone that it should be illegal. A moral image, for example, might include people being polite to each other, and yet it might be totalitarian to have actual laws requiring politeness, complete with penalties for violations. The problem Putnam runs into, according to Harris, is how to reach the conclusion he wants to regarding cloning without having to reach the same conclusions regarding decisions to have a child for an heir, to carry on the family name, to have a brother for Susie, and so on. Harris also notes the use of the phrase designer babies. This term is used negatively and is associated with the parent choosing the features of their children genetically. What Harris points out, however, is that parents already design their babies. Parents already choose the genetic traits of their children based on who they procreate with. They choose racial features and among sets of other general possibilities by selecting their mates. Some of these might be height, beauty, intelligence, assertiveness, sense of humor, or any number of other things. Cloning might make this selection process more precise, but it is not different in kind. People are still selecting genetic traits. Therefore, if there is something morally wrong about trying to determine one's child's genetic makeup, then every parent who carefully selects a mate based on his or her genetic traits is guilty. Harris also criticizes Putnam's claim that every baby has a right to be a surprise to its parents. If we are to take that seriously, he says, then we should use genetic manipulation so that babies are not similar to their parents genetically. For example, a Caucasian couple might have a child with Chinese features, or a black family might have a baby with Irish features, and so on. Now that would be a surprise. Finally, Harris closes by noting that there is one kind of surprise that parents of cloned babies won't be getting. They will not be surprised by genetic diseases because they would choose healthy DNA donors who would also be carefully screened. No surprise cystic fibrosis. No surprise sickle cell anemia. No surprise muscular dystrophy. And he says that that is a moral image we should all share. And that concludes this presentation. I hope you think about the arguments presented in both pieces, and I will talk to you next time.